Hi everyone. In this video, I would like to talk about why so many of us have a harsh inner critic. So there's lots of things we need to understand why we have the certain coping mechanisms that we do. So for everyone it's different. Some people are going to have a really harsh inner critic. Other people might have one but they're not so aware of it. And other people might be a bit more compassionate to themselves, because those two things, being self-compassionate and having a harsh inner critic, are two opposites, aren't they? It's difficult to have both of them, so we tend to have one or the other. And when we come from a narcissistic family, it tends to be the case that we don't have much self-compassion. We can over-empathize with other people, but we might not have a lot of empathy for ourselves. So how do we make sense of why this might be? Because on a superficial level, it doesn't seem to make sense, does it? Why do I dislike myself so much? Why am I so hard on myself? Why am I so self-loathing? Why do I say things to myself that I wouldn't dare to say to anyone else? Because if we said the things to other people that we say to ourselves, then it's probably not going to go down very well, is it? So I'm going to talk about all sorts of things in this video. I think it'll be quite interesting. I find this kind of thing interesting. Hopefully it will be for you also. Okay, so let's have a look at why many people have a harsh inner critic. Okay, so the same as the human body wants to achieve homeostasis, we also want to achieve this psychologically also. So we want to keep things balanced, functioning, everything working smoothly and properly and comfortably as much as we can. So if we look at the definition of homeostasis for the human body, we have here, I'm on Britannica.com. Homeostasis is any self-regulating process by which an organism tends to maintain stability while adjusting to conditions that are best for its survival. If homeostasis is successful, life continues. If it's unsuccessful, it results in a disaster or death of the organism. The stability that the organism reaches is rarely around an exact point, such as the idealized human body temperature of 37 degrees centigrade. Stability takes place as part of a dynamic equilibrium, which can be thought of as a cloud of values within a tight range in which a continuous change occurs. The result is that relatively uniform conditions prevail. So what's an example of homeostasis in a living thing? Body temperature. Number of factors affect this: hormones, metabolic rate, disease, etc., etc. The human mind is the same way, and our system of defenses are also the same way. So we have a functioning self, that's the self that we're conscious of on a daily basis, that goes on with life, carries on with life, copes. And then we have, when we come from a narcissistic family, we're going to have lots of defenses underlying. So we're going to have fight, flight, freeze, submit and attach defenses. Those are the defenses we share with the mammals. Then we're going to have our own personal, unique set of defenses, unique to each of us, which is going to be adapted to the household which we grew up in, and also is unique to our own character. We can only work with the materials we have, can't we? So some people are going to come out of a narcissistic family being more codependent. Some people are going to come out of a narcissistic family being narcissistic. We each have our own set of defense mechanisms, and for some people they have a harsh inner critic. So for some people their harsh inner critic gives a constant narrative on everything they're doing. For some people it's an audible voice in their head. So we can look at it as an operating system. So we can use a computer analogy here. So we have the operating system is the user interface, I think it's called, where that's the screen that we look at, or the app that we look at. It's what we interact with. And then we have this with the world, don't we? So we have our persona that we put on, and we go out and we deal with the world and we deal with people. And we want to keep that functioning. So this is part of that homeostasis. Psychological homeostasis is that we want to keep functioning as best as we can. We don't want to fall apart. We want to keep things stable. So there's the part that people see, and then there's the part that people don't see, all the coding. So we can think of ourselves like that in a way. So we're going to have different kinds of files that we put things in and then we close them. We don't want to open them. So some might have horrible memories in. Lots of people have memory gaps when they come from a narcissistic family. Some people have short memory gaps. Some people have long periods of time where they don't remember anything. And this stuff can be filed away because it's too painful to look at or it's too destabilizing. We can look at it in both ways. The pain is destabilizing, or the horror is destabilizing. So there are files where there are things filed away that we don't want to open. And then there are files where we file away our defenses. And these we open when we need them to stabilize the rest of the operating system. So let's say we're triggered by something in the outside world. Then a defense will open up. One of those files will open up and it will blend with our conscious self. So this might be anger. This might be an addictive part of ourselves. This might be a part of ourselves that longs to be close to other people. It can take lots of forms. And it can be good also to think in terms of prompts as well as triggers. So triggers tend to be an intense reaction to something. So we go from 0 to 60 in a couple of seconds. We have an intense feeling that we can't shake. And it sometimes, in retrospect, will seem disproportionate to the event we're reacting to. So this is what we're familiar with in terms of the idea of triggers, but triggers can also be prompts, so they can be really subtle and we can have subtle reactions to things. We're kind of prompted and pushed into a reaction rather than having an extreme reaction to something all of the time. So of course at first we're going to notice our extreme reactions, and then the more self-awareness we develop, we're going to notice when we're prompted by events. So something that happens in the outside world, something that happens in our inner world, like something that we're thinking about that prompts a certain state of being or opens one of these files, and then we go into a coping mechanism. We might, worst case scenario, think, catastrophize. We might have our inner critic activated. You know, you're pathetic to feel like this. Get on with life. Why are you falling apart? You're ridiculous, etc., etc. So it's useful to think of it like a computer operating system. So on the surface, we can notice some things that are happening. And of course, lots of things are going on subconsciously. So what we want to do is make the unconscious conscious. Then we can be more aware of what's going on for us. And then we can start to change things when things are made conscious. And then it's also useful to think about this in terms of parts. So these are all parts of us that are locked away in these files, all parts of our consciousness, parts of our soul, whatever your personal philosophy is on what we are and why we're here, etc. These are complicated questions. And by describing us as a computer operating system or different parts, I don't want it to sound really reductionist, because it might sound reductionist, but it's not, in terms of we are much more than the sum of what makes up how we defend ourselves when we've come from trauma, what makes up those trauma responses. So when we've come from a narcissistic family, we've probably got complex PTSD. All of our system is working together under the surface to keep things running. We don't have to pay a lot of conscious thought to it. It's explained in terms of the triune brain model, which is an outdated model now, but they talk in terms of responses coming from our reptilian brain, our mammalian brain, and our logical brain getting switched off when those are activated. And that's why we don't have much conscious control over our responses to things, our reactions to things. So the more we understand ourselves, it's like a puzzle, and we ask ourselves questions, wonder why we do things, become curious, and then we can start to get to know ourselves much better and put together the parts of the puzzle, basically, so that everything makes sense. So we understand why we do the things that we do, why we say the things that we say. Our defenses are a computer system, an operating system, and this all structured itself, or we structured it, because we worked with what materials we had. And even at a young age, we were deciding what responses sat well with us. So what fit with our conscience and how we wanted to be, which is really important because for a lot of people, they did make decisions at a really young age. So we might look back and think that we didn't have much power, but that's the power that we did have in choosing our response to things. Then they became ingrained and automatic, but we made those decisions in the beginning. So that's really interesting and useful to know. So many people are aware that they thought from a very young age, 5 or 6, 7 years old, I want to be the opposite of my mother, for example, if they had a narcissistic mother. And that's really interesting. So those, our conscience and our wants and needs shape who we become. So it's nature and nurture, all shape who we become. But then also going through trauma, we're obviously shaped by the events of what it's like to live in an unstable, hostile household. So while our physical body is engaged with maintaining physical homeostasis, psychologically we're engaged with maintaining psychological homeostasis. So we can think of this like scales also. So on one side we have the trauma that we're carrying that we haven't processed yet when we're still in recovery. So this can be those heavy, dark feelings that belong there, which is shame, guilt, anger, hatred. Anger is a normal emotion, but I'm talking about suppressed anger or rage when we haven't been able to be assertive or come from a healthy family that knows how to communicate with each other. So there are going to be darker elements attached to the anger. You're going to have anger, rage, lots of coping mechanisms. And emotion is the language of the body. So this is the language of the operating system. And we have our real self. So we balance the trauma with our coping mechanisms. So if we have a look at this animation here, we have trauma on one side of the scales, and then we balance this with our coping mechanisms. And then if we take one away, then it generally tends to transmute into something else. So if we take away alcohol, then it comes back as marijuana. Or if we take away marijuana, then we might replace it with alcohol. So if the root of the addictive behaviour, of the addictive coping mechanism, which belongs to our flight defences, if the root of it's not dealt with or solved, then that's when we can't escape that behaviour and we use something else instead. So we have this trauma, and then we have the coping mechanisms that we balance the trauma with. This is an adapted version of ourselves, so we can also bring in the idea of the real self and the false self here, or the adapted self. So what the real self is the self that we would have become without the trauma, without having a narcissistic parent, because a narcissistic parent doesn't allow their child to become assertive, become independent, and grow into themselves, and to recognize their own wants and needs, because for the narcissist, it's all about them and their needs. So that's punished in the child, and they're rewarded for being dependent and passive and compliant and obedient, all of those things. And they're rewarded for becoming an adapted version of themselves, punished for being their real selves. So what then happens in the psyche is that we have our real self and aspects of that suppressed. So they're filed away in computer files, seen as dangerous or shameful actually by the rest of the system, because those parts of us caused punishment. So what do? We end up often creating an inner world that mirrors the outside world. So we're going to have the real self suppressed, aspects of ourselves suppressed, wanting to be independent suppressed. I'm talking in general terms here, so in a simplistic way, but it works like this. There's of course going to be exceptions to things that I'm saying. Like, for example, I'll say that we generally go into submissive responses, but then also we can be quite rebellious and go into our fight responses a lot also. So it's complicated, it's complex. We have our real self, and then we have certain emotions, which James Masterson, author of The Search for the Real Self, speaks about in that book. And he speaks about the 6 horsemen of the psychic apocalypse. So it's a fear that if we don't live in this adapted self, if we don't live in these coping mechanisms, if we don't be what other people want us to be rather than what we want to be, again, this is simplistic because we're often also pursuing in ways things that the real us wants. We generally have the real self underneath. Then we have those 6 horsemen of the psychic apocalypse. So these are despair, emptiness, hopelessness, guilt, rage, panic. And these emotions are what we tend to feel when we go into self-activating. That's if we try to be our real self. And if we want to meet our own needs and not meet the needs of someone else, if we're a people pleaser and a codependent, then those emotions will tend to come up. So with the people pleasing aspect of a lot of people, which is a coping mechanism, so it's an adapted part of ourselves, an aspect of ourselves. So perhaps we could say that a person who is a people pleaser would have been empathic anyway, cared for others anyway. But when it's a coping mechanism, means it's an extreme version of itself. So we're too people pleasing and we're unbalanced. It's not a balanced aspect in our lives because we please other people, but then we tend to ignore our own needs. So let's say that we want to do something for ourselves, then we might suddenly have a strong feeling of guilt. So many people have this, a strong guilt that I'm doing something wrong, which steers us back to being in the role of serving for others and people pleasing. And in terms of having a harsh inner critic, some people have this really strongly. Some people have a constant narrative in their mind in what they're doing. For some people, it's audible. So apparently the statistic is that between 1% and 3% of the general public have an audible voice in their mind. So for traumatized people, that figure is probably going to be higher because of this structure of the defenses and that fragmented sense of self, as Janina Fisher calls it in her book Healing the Selves of Trauma Survivors. On the surface, it can look like a fragmented self because we have a going on with normal life self, and then we have these other triggered or prompted defensive reactions that belong to the fight, flight, freeze, submit and attach. But underneath the surface, it's actually all working in quite a fluid way. And the more we get to know ourselves, the more we'll understand the patterns of how they all work. So if we look at the inner critic then, the inner critic is going to have been a part of ourselves that if we hadn't come from trauma, such a hostile environment, then that part of ourselves might have been a cheerleader for ourselves, or it might have been a part that deals with constructive criticism, helps us get where we need to be, what went well, what didn't go well, what we could do better. But because it's in an extreme role, then it's really harsh and it can call us awful things like say that we're pathetic or a loser or ridiculous. It can have this kind of narrative, and this in itself keeps us stable and in psychological homeostasis. Why? So if we think about our defenses, if we had lots of self-compassion and lots of care for ourselves and we liked ourselves a lot, then most of the defense mechanisms that we use, we wouldn't be able to use. So if we talk about our flight defense, for example, so the emotions that belong to that one are feeling trapped, feeling distant, suspicious, unsafe, and people can get a sudden trapped feeling, so needing to get out. And the body language that goes with that can be restless legs when we're moving our legs up and down in a really quick motion, like we're ready to run and the body's already half running as it sits there. Fidgeting, sitting on the edge of a chair, looking away to doors and windows. Some people are aware of where the exits are. all of the time, or they even sit near an exit, because there's that part of them in there knowing they need to be able to run at any moment. Because the thing is, with those files, with things that we file away and with our defenses, they live in the timelessness of the subconscious. They exist in the time that they were created and separated off from the rest of the conscious mind. So part of the recovery process actually is updating the software, so to speak. So it's telling those parts of us that we're safer now. So obviously that's not applicable for everyone, because some people are still living with a narcissistic partner or a narcissistic parent. But the fear exists in them that's as strong as when they were a young child. And as that's the language of the body, this is what our defenses operate out of. Some people say there are two emotions, fear and love. So it can be good to look at what we're doing and what emotion that action or thought might be rooted in. And a lot of the time when we've come from trauma, they're rooted in fear. So this is part of developing our self-awareness as well, is getting to understand those things. So behaviours of flight, sitting close to doors and windows, eating disorders, which is a relief which doesn't depend on anyone, addictions, being unable to commit, being ambivalent, being distant, wanting to run away, thoughts and beliefs, don't let anyone get too close, I have to get out of here and I don't want to feel, and triggers are too much emotion. So if we think in terms of what coping mechanisms are going to come out of flight, they're going to be not being committed in relationships, keeping distance from other people, which means that we can be very lonely and isolated. Addictions usually mean self-destructive behaviours, so we can drink alcohol, which ruins us physically. We can spend a lot of money, which means that we're in trouble financially. These behaviours can be very self-destructive and self-sabotaging also. So they kind of depend on having a lack of care for ourselves. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to use these coping mechanisms. And when people do recover from trauma, they move away from them. They stop smoking, they stop drinking, they stop using drugs, and they have healthier coping mechanisms, like having assertive communication, for example, being able to say no, which is something that we struggle to do when we are people-pleasing, still traumatized, that we haven't processed the trauma yet. So we're still living in fear, even though we might not be able to consciously feel it a lot. We're disconnected from it and it's subconscious. So this is the reason why we struggle to have self-compassion for a long time. So for some people, it takes months and months to get to a place where they like themselves more. But this is the key to healing. So I think half the battle is understanding why we do what we do. And then things make sense. And then we can move to that place where we like ourselves more and we have self-compassion for ourselves, because our relationship with ourselves changes then. And then the inner critic changes to being more supportive. Our addictions change into other kinds of coping behaviours. Maybe we exercise instead to clear our minds. Let's say we go for a walk a couple of times a week. Obviously not obsessive exercise where we're doing it every day for hours, because that would be another coping mechanism, another extreme behaviour that's not healthy particularly. But if we develop healthy coping mechanisms that are good for us, then that's how we can process things, and they come from a place of us liking ourselves. So we want to eat healthily, we want to exercise and be fit, and we don't want to be so self-destructive. Some people call the inner critic the internalized voice of the abuser. So there are some articles that you might come across that talk about that, and that can be explained in terms of we may internalize the abusive parent. We talk to ourselves in their words because it's a way of defending ourselves from them. So we already have that internalized voice. We kind of tell ourselves that we're pathetic, or we're losers, or we're not good enough, or we need to suck it up, or don't exaggerate, don't be so sensitive. All those kind of things that we might tell ourselves when we come from a narcissistic family. And if we have internalized them, it's like we've preempted the strike almost in that psychological warfare. So we're already telling ourselves what we will be told, and that means that we're going to do to ourselves what they would do to us. So we're going to then have submissive body language and stave off an attack that way. So maybe on some level it's preferable for us to attack ourselves and put ourselves down than to be attacked from an outside force. Also, another thing about coming from a narcissistic family is it's often dangerous to be happy or carefree or successful. This will draw criticism and punishment. So this can be another way that we regulate ourselves. If we have a narrative of you're a loser, you're no good at anything, you're not good enough, you're not going to achieve anything, then this can help us to not achieve things and to not even hope to achieve anything also. There are lots of layers to what can go on for us psychologically. So there's the internalizing the abuser. We can look at it that way. We can look at it that we structure our own internal world, which mirrors the outside world in many ways. We reject the parts of ourselves that are rejected by the outside world. Most of the time, not always. And then it's good to have a harsh inner critic, because then we can use all these coping mechanisms like addictions and self-sabotaging behavior, masochistic behaviors also, and keep ourselves stable and also not achieving too much and achieving just enough. Sometimes it looks like that for a lot of people. A lot of people underachieve academically because they're going through so much in their teenage years. Often addictions start then. Battling addictions, battling eating disorders also very commonly start around age 13, 14, 15, something like that. So we move into these areas of our mind, and that's where that aspect of reality becomes completely true for us when we're in there. So some people call this black and white thinking. You know, we're in the devaluing part of our mind, the black part of our mind, or in the white part of our mind where we're idealizing. We're thinking in terms of always, never, that kind of language. And it's an extreme way of thinking, and it's an unrealistic way of thinking because it's black and white and it's not grey. So to be in a realistic place, we need to be in a grey place of thinking where things are nuanced and complicated and we can see things from different sides. Things aren't simplistic. So when we're in this aspect of ourselves, let's say fear comes up for us. So we're here shouting in the street. We come from a household where this is a trigger for us because shouting means there's chaos and drama going on and it's always going to end badly and dramatically. So somebody shouting will trigger our fear, and then we'll only be in that aspect of ourselves. So we have our conscious mind, and then we have that fear file defense, which is triggered. So then we go into a state of hypervigilance. We're ready to fight or run. So of course this happens for everyone. Everyone has these defenses, but when we come from a narcissistic family, when we come from trauma, we're going to have intense responses to normal everyday occurrences actually. So, you know, people arguing in the street, a person who doesn't come from this kind of background is probably going to think, oh, someone's arguing over there, and not be particularly responsive to it physically. But for someone from trauma, that file gets opened that exists in the time where it was made. So it's never been updated, so to speak, if we haven't been through therapy or if we haven't done self-development in terms of understanding ourselves, then we're going to be triggered by this. And to understand how our brains work, what's really interesting here is to look at studies that have been done into dissociative identity disorder. So this is what they used to call multiple personality disorder. So now they recognize it's dissociative. So dissociative is on a spectrum, and we have daydreaming at one end. We have really concentrating on an activity. We have that normal dissociation at one end, and then at the other end we have dissociative identity disorder. And then kind of in the middle and just under the middle, we have PTSD, and we have complex PTSD, and we have personality disorders also. So these are dissociative disorders. What's really interesting is there's research been done. They've done brain scans on people with DID, and this helps to make sense as to how can we have dissociative parts? How can parts of our brain kind of our consciousness be filed away, and then they're activated, they pop up for a day or two or an hour or half an hour, and then they switch off again or go back down again, or they subside. So there's an article here called Could Dissociative Identity Disorder Explain Life, the Universe and Everything by Bernardo Kastrup, Kastrup. And he and the other people that wrote this speak about, in 2015, doctors in Germany reported the extraordinary case of a woman who suffered from what has traditionally been called multiple personality disorder and today is known as dissociative identity disorder. The woman exhibited a variety of dissociated personalities, which are also known as alters, some of which claim to be blind. Using EEGs, the doctors were able to ascertain that the brain activity normally associated with sight wasn't present while a blind alter was in control of the woman's body, even though her eyes were open. Remarkably, when a sighted alter assumed control, the usual brain activity returned. This was a compelling demonstration of the literally blinding power of extreme forms of dissociation, a condition in which the psyche gives rise to multiple, operationally separate centres of consciousness, each with its own private inner life. So if we think of this in terms of complex PTSD or dissociative identity not otherwise specified, then those dissociated parts are going to have their own private inner life, yes, and be an aspect of the main personality, but quite a one-dimensional aspect of the main personality. So the addicted part just wants to take care of a bottle of wine every day and make sure a bottle of wine gets drunk. Or the people-pleasing part, we can go into people-pleasing mode where we really care about other people so much and it's so important to us. And then when we're in that aspect of ourselves, that whole aspect becomes an overwhelming part of ourselves, and we are that. So many people think about their defense mechanisms is that's just me, that's what I'm like, can't do anything about it, can't change it, when actually we're fundamentally the same person and it's all rooted in our character, but we're an extreme version of ourselves. And as we heal and get better, then the extremeness of these mood states, or the extremeness of the people-pleasing subsides, for example. So we do learn to be able to say no, we do learn to put our own needs first, and we do learn to be able to put boundaries in, whereas we may not have been able to do that before because we were conditioned against that, or that people-pleasing part of us is conditioned against that. Whereas, of course, in another part of our mind, in another part of our internal world, our fight defenses exist. So fight defenses actually dislike our submissive defenses. So our fight defenses might think about us when we're like that, when we're people-pleasing. Why can't you stand up for yourself? Why are you going along with this? Why don't you just say no? Or we just get a feeling of anger that we can't put any thought to or any words to. And it's the response of that fight part that thinks, might think, oh, you're a bit pathetic. That in itself can be quite critical in a critic. Modern neuroimaging techniques have demonstrated that DID is real. In a 2014 study, doctors performed functional brain scans on both DID patients and actors simulating DID. The scans of the actual patients displayed clear differences when compared to those of the actors, showing that dissociation has an identifiable neural activity fingerprint. In other words, there is something rather particular that dissociative processes look like in the brain. There is also compelling clinical data showing that different alters can be concurrently conscious and see themselves as distinct identities. So really interesting that there can be the going on with normal life self, the functioning self, the self that you generally feel that you're in and you present to the world, and then an angry part there at the same time, and then a shameful part there at the same time. Obviously they're talking about DID and I'm talking about it in terms of complex PTSD. So we can have an angry part there, and then a part that's also triggered and feels shame that we're angry. So it can be quite complex But the more we develop our self-awareness, the more then we can become aware of these distinctions between these parts of ourselves. So they all feel different, they all look different, they have different thoughts, different body language, different feeling, different body sensations also. And of course, these parts of ourselves weren't integrated when we were in early childhood because we didn't come from a nurturing, loving household when we've come from a narcissistic household. So that's why we have that fragmented sense of self, or a divided self. The history of this condition dates back to the early 19th century, with a flurry of cases in the 1880s through to the 1920s. The massive literature on the subject confirms the consistent and uncompromising sense of separateness experienced by the alter personalities. It also displays compelling evidence that the human psyche is constantly active in producing personal units of perception and action that might be needed to deal with the challenges of life. We may be at a loss to explain precisely how this creative process occurs, but the clinical evidence nevertheless forces us to acknowledge something is happening that has important implications for our views about what is and is not possible in nature. So they talk a bit about consciousness, the universe, physics, etc. Yeah, so looking for fundamental truths, I think it's interesting to look at things on that level. So on a level in our own mind, on a level in our families that we come from, and in a level in societies, countries, and the collective human race. It's really interesting. And another reason why we may have a strong inner critic is to keep us in line in terms of being accepted in the family or not. So we can think of a narcissistic family like being born into a cult. So the prominent narcissistic parent, because sometimes there can be two. So the narcissist in charge constructs the narrative of the family, and their narrative and their reality is the one that everyone else has to go along with. And they're punished if they don't. And as we know, when we come from a narcissistic family, it's my way or the highway. So there's a strong sense of, if we don't go along with the narrative of the narcissistic parent, then there'll be rejection and punishment and shunning and abandonment, basically. That's what happens to people when they leave a cult, doesn't it? They get not dismembered. They get shunned and dis something. So someone who leaves a cult, they don't go along with the narrative, they leave, they get shunned, their family members cut them off, and they're excommunicated and seen as a bad person, a pariah. So this is what we go through, isn't it, when we've come from a narcissistic family. If you step out of line, or if you're the scapegoat child, then you're going to be smeared. So it's known as a smear campaign, isn't it? That process of devaluation to everyone and being humiliated and embarrassed and having your personal details told to everyone. That happens, and then, you know, there's a fear of abandonment underlying all of this, and we can see that in James Masterson's book. There's chapter 4 in there, which is called The Fear of Abandonment, which is so influential in keeping people in line. So not only do we want to be loved and accepted, and of course we want to be loved and accepted by our parents, that's natural, but also that fear of, if I don't go along with what I'm supposed to go along with, then that's going to leave me with no one. So I'll be shunned by everyone. People will go along with the narcissistic narrative, and then I'll be alone. And this is really hard for a lot of people because they have no safety net. There can be a feeling of that, like, I'm out in the world on my own. There's no one to help me if something goes wrong. And you know, this is unfortunately reality for people coming from a narcissistic family, that it's making that decision. It's, I'm alone and I'm going to do things myself. So some people adapt to that more easily. They're really self-reliant. They've coped themselves since a really young age. They haven't asked for help for years, and they tend to not ask for help as much as they can. For other people, they might be a bit needier, so they have these really strong attached parts, and they really long to be with their abusive parents and try to find ways to adapt themselves so that they can be with that parent. So for everyone, they present a different picture. Some people have those more longing, needy, attached parts. Some people have stronger fight parts. Some people have stronger flight parts. So it looks different for everyone. But for everyone, there's going to be that underlying fear of abandonment and that sense of I'm alone in the world and there's no one to help me in an emergency. A harsh inner critic can help keep us in line in that way. Kind of an inner traitor to ourselves, actually. So suppressing that self-compassion, or our whole system works like that. We've suppressed our self-compassion. We have empathy for others, but not for ourselves. And we have that harsh inner critic that's really dominant and keeps us in line, keeps us people-pleasing, keeps us knowing, in air quotes, how terrible we are, how useless we are, what a shameful person we are. And this keeps everything, keeps us feeling maybe safer. So we're always going to be making that choice. So do I stay in this family that's awful, or do I go out into the world alone? Really difficult decisions, and something that's a factor for people. It can be throughout their lives. So really interesting, and yeah, good to know what it is and why it's there. What purpose does it serve? So we can get to understand ourselves better. And then we can have an inner world that isn't so harsh, because that's really hard to live with, isn't it? That level of intense criticism for a lot of the time, and never being allowed to relax or feel good about ourselves because we're regulating ourselves. We're trying to keep stable, keep homeostasis, trying to manage all these different aspects of ourselves, trying to keep files closed, not understanding why some files open and then we can't close them again. Of course, we're not going to think in terms of that. We're going to think, why am I so angry? And why have I been angry for 2 days and I can't shake it and I can't stop being angry and I can't calm myself down? So that's going to be our conscious experience of those dissociative parts of ourselves. So the more we know, the more we can integrate those parts of us, and the more we understand that why they're there, then the more we can move to a place where understanding leads to accepting ourselves and liking ourselves more as well, when everything makes sense. And then when we like ourselves, that's when we want more for us, and then we don't want to have these self-destructive ways of being. And that harsh inner critic is going to soften, and it's going to be more encouraging and be more of a cheerleader for us, rather than ripping us to shreds and telling us how terrible we are. So I hope the information in that video was useful for you. I think all this stuff is really interesting, and it's good to be aware of this stuff, to have more self-awareness, because that's the key to getting out of these psychological traps that we're in. So we're kind of trapped in these thought processes. We're trapped in those coping mechanisms. Yeah, and self-awareness is the key to becoming free of them. But it all starts with self-awareness. So thanks for watching, and enjoy your day, evening, night. Bye.